to our online talk series, Waterford and the 1920 local elections, Fighting for a Voice and a New Ireland. This is part of the Waterford Decade of Commemorations events programme, supported by Waterford City and County Council and the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht under the Decade of Centenary's 2012 to 2023 initiative. I am delighted to introduce Heather Laird. Heather is a lecturer in English at University College Cork. Her research interests include theories and practices of resistance, legal pluralism, critical radical historical frameworks, the intersection between class and gender and Irish culture since the 19th century. She is the author of Subversive Law in Ireland and Commemoration. She is an editor of Síreacht, Longings for Another Ireland, a series of short, topical books that seeks to reinvigorate the social imagination and encourage speculation on alternatives to current orthodoxies. Her talk is titled Illegal Law, the Doyle Courts, 1920 to 1924.
Hello everyone, so I'm here today to talk to you about the Doyle Courts. And I suppose the first question to ask is, what were the Doyle Courts? And they were the alternative court system that was in operation in Ireland during the War of Independence. And that system was only fully replaced in 1924. Another term that you might hear in relation to them is the Republican courts. Now, one way to think about the Doyle Courts, and it's a way that I think is particularly useful, is as the legal front of the War of Independence. So, key to the War of Independence, as we know, was the establishment of a counter-state. So, Dáil Éireann was obviously key to that, the setting up of an alternative parliament. But the Doyle Courts were also very important in this regard, though they've received considerably less scholarly attention than either the political or military fronts of the War of Independence. So the Doyle Courts were in operation throughout the country, with the exception of County Antrim and the city of Belfast. The Doyle Court system was comprised of a Supreme Court, a district court that was ran by lay people in every parliamentary constituency, and linked to these were circuit court sittings by legally trained judges for more complex cases and appeals, and then a local court system in every Roman Catholic parish, again ran by lay people. And these lay people were often people with some standing in the community. So a little known fact, for example, is that Terence McSweeney was arrested while presiding over a Doyle court. There were also special courts for dealing with land issues, and I'm going to come back to that because they were really crucial in terms of the setting up of the Doyle court system. So the Doyle Courts ran parallel to and to some extent displaced the official legal system. And something to keep in mind is that the official legal system was under considerable strain at this point in time. Courthouses, for example, had been damaged throughout the country, and there were other attempts to impede their operations. So, for example, judges arriving in an area to preside over a court case might find that they're refused accommodation. And again, they were just some of the simpler ways that the official legal system was being impeded at this point in time. Okay, so I suppose to start off about the Doyle Courts, it's useful to think about the context. And I would break the context into the long-term context for the long-term origins, and then the more immediate context. So, in a little plug here, in my book Subversive Law in Ireland, published in 2005, I argued that there's a long history of alternative legal concepts and structures in Ireland. And in that book as well, I point out the resistance to an official legal system that many in Ireland associated with the conquest of the country, and that some considered very much the kind of landlord's law, created a space for the establishment of alternative legal concepts and structures. And these included everything from unwritten law or the unwritten agrarian code to repeal association arbitration courts, ribbon association courts, land league courts, national league courts, and united Irish league courts. So one of my arguments in relation to the Doyle Courts is that really they're a culmination of, they don't come out of nowhere, they're a kind of culmination of a long history in Ireland of resistance to British rule in Ireland that involves setting up de facto alternatives to official institutions. And in fact, I would argue that Dáil Éireann itself is embedded also in that, the first Dáil was also embedded in that long context. Now, how the Doyle Courts differed from these alternative forms of legality, these earlier alternative forms of legality, is that they dealt with all forms of crime, and they also used a written constitution to do that. Also, they much more closely mirrored the official legal system. Now, a more immediate context is heightened agrarian agitation in 1920, particularly in the first half of the year. The number of agrarian outrages was higher in the earlier months of 1920 than in any other time since the land war period proper, and that's a sort of little known fact. Most people in Ireland, when they think about land agitation or the land movement, they're really thinking about the late 19th century. But land agitation ran right up through this revolutionary period. The forms that it took was mostly seizures of land and cattle drives. So in the early 1920s, that's the form that agrarian agitation largely took. Grazing farm was especially targeted, so large farms that were being used for the grazing of cattle. In the early 19th and early 20th, or in the late 19th and early 20th century, there had been a kind of coalition of sorts between the land movement and the national movement. And to a large extent, the land movement had been the driving force behind the national movement. But that coalition of interests had begun to break down by the beginning of the 20th century, and particularly with the passing of the more significant land purchase acts, such as the Wyndham Act of 1903. And in the opinion of more mainstream nationalists, the land question had been more or less answered by these land purchase acts, and those who were continuing to engage in agrarian agitation, they considered those to be largely out of kilter with the national project and the needs of the nation. But I think what we have to keep in mind is that a substantial number of people in rural Ireland, particularly in the more congested areas, didn't really benefit hugely by the Land Acts and the Land Purchase Acts. Their day-to-day lives continued pretty much as they were. There was still significant land hunger in parts of the country. And the First World War had really added to that already existing land hunger, because there were restrictions on wartime emigration, and also rising beef prices meant the grazing land was in greater demand. So you have this demand for grazing land at the same time that actually you have people needing that land for day-to-day sustenance, for essentially day-to-day living. And I think it would have been very difficult for the poorer rural dwellers at this time to really distinguish their acts of land agitation from those that had been committed in the late 19th century, to see that they were very much, I suppose, different than the concerns of their predecessors in late 19th century Ireland. But now they found that they were out of kilter with the national project, and that they also risked not only being in breach of the official legal system, but of this alternative legal system associated with the first Dáil. Okay, so that's two contexts for the setting up of the Doyle Courts. But there were then particular events that happened that really triggered off their establishment. So at this point in time, during the earlier stage of the War of Independence, there had been a more informal court system, which was regularly referred to as the Sinn Féin courts, and these were already in operation, but they weren't under direct control of the first Dáil. And there had been some discussion, when the first Dáil was established, there had been some discussion of setting up a court system directly under control of the Dáil, but there hadn't been a sort of a really much of a move on this. But then towards the end of 1919, the first Dáil was approached by a deputation of farmers from Connacht, because Connacht was one of those areas that saw particularly heightened agrarian agitation at this point in time. So the first Dáil was approached, as I said, by this deputation of farmers from Connacht, and these had been the victims of cattle drives and land seizures. Now, I think what's interesting about this is that some of these farmers would not have been, I suppose, particularly in support of the first Dáil. Some of them may even have been unionists, But they had previously sought help from the RIC and had been informed that the police really didn't have the time to be protecting their land or their animals. So the Dáil then, the first Dáil saw this as an opportunity, or at least some members of the first Dáil saw this as an opportunity to really establish themselves as taking charge of the country. So first of all, they sent, they investigated conditions in Connacht, and they sent a few people there to see what was happening and report back. And then after this, they set up the Doyle Court system. So the first Doyle Court case that was under direct control of the first Dáil was held in Ballinrobe, County Mayo in May 1920. And this court case was to pass judgment on a case involving, basically on a situation involving the seizure of land. Now, the judgment in this first court case that was under the direct control of the Dáil, the judgment was in favour of the person who had legal entitlement to the land. The claimants clearly weren't, obviously, as we might imagine, weren't too happy about this. These claimants ranged from a landless labourer to a smallholder on 8 acres of land. And it is reported that they were very angry about the judgment, and they proclaimed aloud, they were heard to proclaim aloud, that this was no Sinn Féin court, and that in fact it was worse than British law. So the claimants went on and disregarded the judgment and continued to occupy the land. Now, it had been hoped, and Arthur Griffith in particular had hoped, that the Doyle Courts could be arbitration courts, that they could be ran by consent. But from this very first court case, it was clear that that wasn't going to happen, that wasn't going to be the case. So an IRA unit then, there was some discussion about what to do about these men who were refusing to follow the judgment of this court case. So an IRA unit was brought in to remove them from the land that they were occupying and to detain them on an island on Lough Corrib. Female relatives of those who were detained on the island continued to occupy the land for at least a short period. And this is just one of the kind of very interesting stories that there is, that exist about the Doyle Courts. And it's something that's very much attracted me to researching in this area, because I think not only are these stories quite fascinating, but they also can be quite revealing about Ireland at the time. So there was an article published in the Limerick Leader about another case at the time that again I think paints a very revealing and interesting picture, particularly about mixed loyalties in Ireland at this point in time. The article tells of 2 men who were detained on an island off the Clare coast for 3 weeks, following their refusal to rebuild a demolished wall and contested land. Members of the RIC arrived in a boat to rescue them, but the men threw stones at them and basically told them to go away, told them that the RIC had no authority over the affairs of citizens of the Irish Republic. So again, the mixed loyalties are very evident here. The RIC turned around and left the men to serve out their sentences. Now these men, it's quite clear that political independence of the sort that the First Dáil represented was not an irrelevancy to them. But at the same time, they weren't going to accept that their material needs were less than the need of the First Dáil to gain the support of more substantial farmers. So Doyle Courts then, they took place, obviously, you know, it's a court system, but it doesn't have at the same time the buildings. We can see here that they don't have jails to put people in. So neither did it have actual proper buildings in which to hold courthouses. So Doyle Court cases took place in all kinds of locations, halls, outhouses, rooms above shops. And in fact, one sitting took place in the solicitors' building in the Four Courts without anyone there knowing that it was happening. So these were illegal courts in that there was an underground element to them. And if they had been arbitration courts, as Arthur Griffith had wanted, the issue around their legality would have been a little bit more cloudy. But because they were court cases then that there could be penalties imposed, that meant that they were viewed as very much illegal. So this underground element, when we read the recollections of those who were involved in the Doyle Courts, and one of those people is Kevin OShea, we can get a sense of what the day-to-day life was like for those involved in the courts. So Kevin OShea, he was a young barrister. He wrote about his involvement in the Doyle Courts in a later series of articles published in the Irish Times. And he described taking on a false name and pretending to be a travelling salesman selling ointment. Other judges pretended to be insurance salesmen. And another interesting fact about these, about the Doyle Courts, is that they were sometimes officiated by women. And this is something I'll come back to, the gender aspect of the Doyle Courts. Legal training was required for the upper rung of the court system, the Supreme Court and the Circuit Court, but not for the lower courts. And a number of those involved had abandoned the official legal system to work for the Doyle Courts. And one figure who did that was a man called Cahir David, the son of Michael David. Michael David being a figure that we very much associate with land agitation in late 19th century Ireland. But his son Cahir David had been called to the bar in 1916. And then went on after that to leave the official legal system and to be appointed a circuit court judge in the Doyle Courts in 1920. At this stage, he was only in his mid-20s, but he was a highly respected figure. And went on to be highly respected in Ireland after that as well, in that he went on to become president of the High Court in Ireland in 1951. So the Doyle Courts, as I said, had a written constitution. Guidelines were drawn up for the use of judges. And these guidelines stated that the law previously in force was to be retained, but references could be made to early Irish law codes if applicable to modern circumstances. So in other words, reference could be made to the Breton laws. And again, a sort of context for that as to the use of the Breton laws. There had been this very large translation project that had happened in the latter half of the 19th century, a project that took the bulk of 50 years to transcribe and translate old Breton law manuscripts. So these were available to draw on and for the judges to refer to. Okay, so, and as I said, the Doyle Courts didn't have access to jails, so punishments could include repairing damage done, fines, being marooned on an island for a period of time, being banished from a county or even from the country. And there were complaints in the House of Commons made at this time that England was essentially being used as a convict settlement by the Irish Doyle Courts. In 1924, the Doyle Courts were subsumed into by the legal system that we have today, which was essentially, even more than the Doyle Courts, a kind of takeover of the official legal system, or a continuation of that. And the dismantling of the Doyle Courts, then, I suppose a question could be asked, well, why was there a need to dismantle them? If they were already quite similar to the official legal system, and the system that came after that was even more so, why was there a need to kind of dismantle them and take them apart? After all, a number of people working from these had made quite big sacrifices by abandoning the official legal system, and then suddenly this legal system, this alternative legal system, is abandoned. And I think the dismantling of them is probably best viewed in the context of pro-treaty and anti-treaty tensions. After all, as I said, the other term used for these courts was the Republican courts, and now it was clear that no republic was on offer. And even the name, the Doyle Courts, was somewhat problematic, as it suggested that link to the first Doyle. Okay, so I want to now pull out some aspects of the Doyle Courts that I've talked about already and maybe focus a little bit more on those. So I mentioned that there were some key figures like Cahir David involved in the Doyle Court system. There were also some figures who are particularly interesting to researchers because they wrote about the Doyle Courts and they're the source of a lot of our knowledge about them. So one of these figures was James Creed Meredith, and his significance is that he had been extremely high up in the official legal system before he abandoned it for the Doyle Courts. He'd been King's Counsel in the official legal system, And because of his standing in the official legal system, he was made president of the Dáil Supreme Court. So here's a man who's very experienced, very high up in the official legal system, but interestingly, he was also one of the strongest exponents of the incorporation of the Breton laws into the Doyle Court system. And his account of the Doyle Courts was published in 1940 in a journal called the Journal of the Statistical and Social Inquiry Society of Ireland. And again, it's a very sort of interesting account of his personal engagements with the Doyle Court system, his involvement with it and his assessment of it. Kevin O'Shea is another person who is of interest because he wrote about the Doyle Courts. He was a judge in the specially convened Doyle Land Courts, and he published a series of articles in the Irish Times in 1966. And he's one of our main sources of information, for example, about that first Doyle Court, the Ballinrobe case. His articles are also a really good source of information about the agrarian agitation that led to the establishment of the Doyle Courts, as he was one of the people who was sent by the first Dáil to investigate that agrarian agitation. I suppose a word of warning about that, though, is that when we read his account of agrarian agitation in that period in Ireland, we have to acknowledge the fact that he's coming from the perspective of somebody who is essentially seeking to contain it. We're not necessarily getting the viewpoint of those who were engaged in agrarian agitation at the time. Though I think in some of his articles, he makes a really good attempt to explain the justifications behind the agrarian agitation, the kinds of conditions that people are living under, and certainly the frustrations that people might have felt if they're living on these small holdings that they can barely live on, and they have these large grazing farms beside them. Another aspect of the Doyle Courts that I want to say a bit more about, that I've just alluded to very briefly, is the gender dimension. So women presided over parish court sittings at times, and the women who were involved in parish court sittings included Kathleen Clark, Maud Gawn McBride and Hannah Shee Skeffington. Again, women who would have had a standing in the community and who would have been known. So judges in the Supreme Court and Circuit Court, as I said, had to have legal training, but this was not required for the lower courts, which were mostly presided by lay people. So this facilitated women to get involved, particularly, as I said, women with a profile. Now, these lower courts, of course, they were on the lower rung, but when Doyle Courts records suggest that these were the most active tier of the Doyle Court system. So essentially then, I think we have to consider these women who are involved in parish court sittings as judges, as very much central to the legal front of the War of Independence. And I also think it's important to point out that it took post-revolutionary Ireland over 40 years to come close to matching this level of involvement of women in the legal system. Another woman-related aspect of the Doyle Courts has to do with cases involving women. I've already mentioned James Creed Meredith, who wrote about his involvement as a judge in the courts in 1940. And one of the aspects of the Doyle Courts, one of the interesting aspects that he describes, is his use of the Breton laws in a case involving a single mother. So he claims that in 1920 he was presiding over a case in Cork involving a single mother who was seeking monetary support from the father of the child, and that he gave his judgment in accordance with what he considered to be the spirit of the Breton laws. And the result was that the woman was awarded a sum of money in compensation for the expenses that she had accrued in looking after the child. Now, Meredith, and again, we only have his I suppose, account of this, but he says that this case was subsequently followed uniformly in the Republican courts system. So in other words, that it set a precedent. So the Doyle Courts were an interesting mix. They were quite conservative on land issues. in that for the most part they protected substantial farmers and private property rights, but they were relatively innovative in their approach to women, both in terms of having women as judges and also in some of the cases involving women. And Dorothy McArdle, who also, a Republican feminist who also wrote about the Doyle Court system, even though she wasn't personally involved, she claimed that in Doyle Court cases where women were being charged, that actually a female judge had to be part of the kind of the system in terms of judging this particular woman. And again, this is something that I only have found her account of, but it certainly does suggest that even if this wasn't followed uniformly, it certainly suggests that there were interesting aspects, gender aspects to the Doyle Courts. And as an aside, some of you may have seen Ken Loach's film, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, Ken Loach's 2006 film. And that features a Doyle Court case with a female judge. So he has a woman judge who is presiding over Doyle Court. And then we see in Ken Loach's film this woman being undermined by an IRA officer. Essentially, she convicts the accused, but the IRA officer releases the man because he has purchased rifles or financed the purchase of rifles. And what Ken Loach's film, I think, points to here is the conflict that often existed at this time, or could exist at this time, between the legal and military fronts of the War of Independence. A final aspect of the Doyle Courts that I haven't alluded to so far, but I think is also a very important one, is the use of the Doyle Courts as a kind of propaganda weapon. So alternative law in general in Ireland was part of a kind of propaganda machine at a national and international level. Newspapers like the Limerick Leader and the Tipperary People carried regular reports of an alternative administration of justice that was largely fed to them by Sinn Féin publicists. In June 1920, the Freeman's Journal, under a heading Sinn Féin Justice, provided a summary of the work of volunteer patrols in 21 counties over a 6-week period. And it's really interesting to see the kinds of things that are included in this report. I mean, essentially, there's everything from protecting women from abusive language to enforcing licensing laws to solving bank robberies. And the message is clear in articles like this, that those currently fighting for Irish independence are capable of running the country. And I think the Dáil land courts were particularly significant in this regard. The message with the Dáil land courts was that, or the message that was being sent out, I suppose, through the use of the Dáil land courts, was that the counter-state was capable of bringing agrarian agitation under control. And given that agrarian agitation had been something that had confounded the British administration for so long, and that they had been often unable to control, this was quite a coup to be able to say, well, we're able to bring it under control. But notwithstanding attempts to present something akin to normal operations of a state, some of the details given in reports counteract that. So, for example, there are newspaper reports of volunteers seeking a suspect in a crime while they themselves have been hunted by a large contingency of police and military. And there's a kind of keystone cop element to that. Somebody's chasing somebody and somebody else is kind of chasing them. But I think more seriously, or on a bigger note, on an international front, the popular support that the Dáil courts received from the Irish people really helped to sell the viability of the Irish Republican administration abroad. Foreign journalists, not just from Britain but also from France and America, were invited to attend Dáil court hearings, and some did attend. And there was even a newsreel made of a Republican court sitting in Cork City. So, in conclusion then, in terms of concluding remarks, the foundation of an alternative legal system has received considerable less scholarly attention than the establishment of Dáil Éireann. But in my view, it played a really key role in the setting up of a counter-state. And research into this illegal legal system is also important because I think it aids a more complex understanding of a key moment in our revolutionary past. And I hope my talk has revealed that today. So, for example, increased knowledge of the events and motivations that led to its establishment revealed significant tensions at the time over land and resources, and it complicates our general understanding of the relationship between nationalism and the land movement. Also, a greater understanding of the Doyle Courts' operations gives us, I think, a fuller sense of the different kinds of roles that women played in Ireland's revolutionary past. Thank you for listening to this talk.